Welcome to In the Middle, a podcast on Christianity in the Middle East, where we explore questions of history, religion, culture, and policy that affects the ancient and indigenous Christian communities of the Middle East. On November 29th, 2022, I had the pleasure to sit down with Aram Hamparian, Executive Director of the Armenian National Committee of America. We discussed the history and trials of the Armenian people, church, and nation. Just days after our conversation in December 2022, Azerbaijan imposed an illegal blockade on the Lachin Corridor, a critical lifeline which sustains Armenian Christians in the Republic of Artsakh, also known as Nagorno-Karabakh. As of the date of this recording, the blockade has been in place upwards of 3 months and counting, and continues to inflict untold suffering on over 120,000 native Armenian Christians in Artsakh. So, without further ado, thanks for joining the conversation, and welcome to In the Middle. Welcome, Aram. Thanks for joining us. You're a longtime friend of IDC. You're no stranger to what we do, and vice versa. We're very familiar with what the Armenian National Committee of America works on. So we appreciate you joining us today.
It is a great pleasure to be here, Rich. We have been proud to partner with In Defense of Christians from the very start. I don't know that we work closer with any other organization across the U.S., so this is a great privilege for us.
Thank you so much, Aram. Well, I first want to start off with just a general discussion of who are the Armenians, what is Armenia. Growing up and even as students in our professional lives, we've all had Armenian friends, many of us, certainly those of us who grew up in New England, Southern California, and in many other cities across the United States. But I would love to hear from you, Aram. Who are the Armenians, and what makes them a unique people, a unique nation?
Sure. Well, Armenia today is a modern democracy in a very tough neighborhood, but its roots go back thousands and thousands of years. In fact, there's an archaeological record attesting to Armenians existing in that part of the world as an indigenous population as far back as 11,000 years ago. More recently, in the more modern era, Armenians have had 4 different kingdoms over the last 2,000 years. Starting with the Ardashir kingdom, the Arshagunis, the Bagradunis, the Rubenids, various empires over the centuries, and we've existed in the Armenian highland from an area stretching from the Caucasus to central Anatolia. Armenians today number about 10 million worldwide, but only 3 million in the homeland, and that's the result of the history of the last century, which is a history of genocide and persecution and violence by Turkey and Azerbaijan. We can go into that a little bit later. What I can say is that, what I can share is what I think many people, those who know about the Armenians, know that the Armenians were the first nation to convert to Christianity in the early 4th century in 301. But Armenians were Christian far before that. In fact, 2 of the apostles of Jesus, Thaddeus and Bartholomew, both preached in Armenia in the 1st century and converted a great many Armenians. The formal conversion took place in 301 with King Dirtad, bringing the nation itself, the government and the society itself into Christendom. But there's also the story of Noah in the Old Testament. His ark, of course, landed on Mount Ararat, which is a historic Armenian mountain. And Armenian history is kind of woven throughout the biblical tradition. So we're a very ancient people struggling to survive in this modern world in, as I said, a very tough neighborhood.
Thanks for that. Clearly hearing your account as well as the accounts we're all familiar with, we are very familiar with the fact that the Armenian nation is one with Christianity, throughout its history and then, in its very DNA, you might even say. Now, you made the distinction there between Armenia as a nation, as a people, and a country, right? Armenia as a country, but it's more than just a country. It has a unique role. It's not the product of post-colonial or post World War I, the fall of the Ottoman Empire, or the fall of any other great empire. It's a very organically, let's say, created or one with a very organic genesis. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, the Armenians are the indigenous population of that part of the world, and the record, bears that out, in great detail. The fact of the matter is, though, the Armenian homeland over the centuries has been reduced. Armenians have seen their territory partitioned. They are today a genocide survivor state, blockaded, landlocked, under attack. So that's sadly been the history. You have this vast Armenian homeland. In the most recent iteration, the Armenians a century ago found themselves straddling two great empires, the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. But throughout our history, that's happened a great many times. So the first Armenian kingdom that I mentioned, the Artashaksian dynasty, came into being between the Roman and Persian empires. And then for the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, we've seen this play itself out many, many times. Today, Armenia again finds itself between the Russians to the north, the Turks to the west, the Persians to the south, and balancing those interests has become, part of the Armenian DNA. It's a very, very, as I said, difficult neighborhood, a homeland that has lost land, lost lives now for a great period, to the point where today we're literally facing existential threats to Armenia. Just 2 years ago, we can touch on this a little bit later, but just 2 years ago, another portion of Armenia was seized by one of our neighbors, Azerbaijan, and this has been sadly a pattern. And right there on the frontiers of freedom, on the frontiers of faith, stands this democratic Christian nation, which should be the subject of support and solidarity from across the globe, but unfortunately has been abandoned by essentially all the great powers.
Yeah, I found something you said there very interesting early on when you're talking about the history of the shifting empires and shifting borders, how Armenia was constantly in the middle of these shifts, of these, of the crossfire in many cases. And that resonates very strongly with me because many, if not most, Christian communities in the Middle East and the Caucasus, of course, found themselves in a similar circumstance where they're constantly in the crossfire. No stake in any of these conflicts or any of these shifting borders, yet always bearing the brunt. Now, how, in the case of the Armenian nation, how has this affected the Armenian nation? How has it changed them, whether for better or for worse? What mark has it left, that particular unique situation of being between shifting empires?
Sure, I would say self-reliance and resiliency. Armenians, I teach Sunday school, Rich, and one of the first Sundays of every year, I bring out a little weeble. And most people, anyone sort of under 30 might not know what a weeble is, but it's a small toy that you knock it over and it bounces back up. And no matter how many times you knock it over, it bounces back up. That's the resiliency of the Armenian people, as I try to share with third and fourth graders. And also self-reliant. We realize that we need to be self-reliant. I'll give an example. A century ago, during the First World War, the Ottoman Turks decided to destroy the Armenians, wipe out the Armenians, and they did a very, very good job of that, sadly. They wiped out a huge percentage of the Armenians. The Russians, for their part, had their revolution and withdrew from the Caucasus, and Armenians were left alone to fend for themselves. Even at the tail end of the genocide, the Turks invaded under Kemal Ataturk and the new Republican government, essentially, as that transition took place, and invaded Armenia. Armenia was now a land of refugees, literally refugees, just living in tents and camps. Yet they gathered an army and fought 3 battles in May of 1918. And as a result of those 3 battles, were able to fend off the Turks. When the Soviets eventually took over, they saw the Armenians as a nation capable of standing up for themselves and incorporated them into the Soviet Union, but as a full republic, not as just an autonomous oblast or some kind of, lesser entity. And the net effect is Armenia was able to then emerge from the Soviet Union as an independent republic, as one of the constituent states of the republic. And today there's a free Armenia. And that's as difficult as life has been as an independent republic, and it's been very brutal. Thousands and thousands of lives have been lost in the most brutal ways. At the very least, there is a place, and you can draw a line around it, that's called Armenia. And they have an army, and they have a government, and they have the ability, to the extent possible, to fend for themselves. And that's not the case with other Christians in the Middle East who find themselves living under other regimes at the mercy of these very, very powerful groups and interests that are often hostile to even the existence of Christians in their indigenous homeland. So this, I look back at those 3 battles of 1918 and say that was a turning point. That was the do or die moment for the Armenians, and we were able to rely upon ourselves, defend ourselves, establish what became a republic, eventually an independent state now on the world stage. Without that, Had those battles been lost, the Turks would have seized that territory. Armenians would have been scattered, as we have seen, all over the world. And we talk about the Armenians, but there would be no place you could visit. There's no place on a map you can touch that's Armenia.
You know, it's very interesting that you talk about the long history of resiliency of the Armenian nation. But I'm interested if we could go into a bit more detail about the older history and the introduction of Christianity. How has Armenia's place as kind of being between a rock and a hard place affected Christianity as it came to the country, as it was first preached and then later became the official religion?
Sure. So Thaddeus and Bartholomew preached in Armenia. They themselves had many disciples, and Christianity took root in across the territory of the Armenian homeland. But it was resisted by the nobles and by the various kings. They viewed Christianity as a threat. This is not unique to Armenia. So there's a great legend that's told among the Armenians, and historians will know better than I how accurate it is, but it's good enough for me to share with my Sunday school kids. And that is that King Dirtad learned that Gregory, we call him Krikor Lusavorich, which in Armenian is Gregory the Illuminator. Illumination is a theme of Christianity that runs right through Armenian history. And he was preaching in Armenia, and the king learned of it and decided to punish him, in fact, to kill him by throwing him into a pit and to die. But unbeknownst to him, this is as the legend goes, his sister, who had become a Christian, secretly fed him for 14 years in the pit. And at a certain point, the king fell ill, deathly ill, was having both physical and mental problems, emotional problems, and saw no way out. And his sister came to him and said, "I have had a dream that Gregory can heal you." And of course, he's like, "Well, Gregory, I killed him 14 years ago." No. His sister said, "He's around. I took care of him. Let's bring him out, give him a shower, and clean him up, and he will say a prayer for you." He said a prayer and healed the king, and the king, in appreciation of that, understanding the power of the Christian faith, converted the nation. I don't know that it happened exactly that way, guys, but that's as they say, when history meets the facts, when legend meets the facts, you print the legend, as I've heard in the movies. So Armenia became a Christian nation 301. Now, I told you sort of the legend side of it. Another way to think about it, and historians have discussed this at great length, is that Armenia was between these great powers and was not the most powerful among them, and had to, that the nobility and the leadership of the country realized we need to distinguish ourselves in some manner that will mitigate our absorption, or slow down or reverse the absorption of our culture into larger cultures that surround us. And in fact, that's another school of thought, a more, let's say, real politics school of thought about the Armenian conversion. Probably somewhere between inspiration and desperation. So Armenia becomes Christian 301 and faces lots of trouble, especially from the south, because the Persian Empire is not Christian and views Armenian Christianity as a problem. And in fact, starts leaning on Armenia in the early 5th century and mid-5th century, and says, you need to accept our faith, right? Which was some Zoroastrian, variant. And the Armenian nobility, really, there were great debates, and you can read the history on this. Should we accommodate to this our neighbor? They're much more powerful than us. And others were like, no, we must stand by our faith. There was the religious side to it. There was also the political side to it. The bottom line is, in 451, the Persians marched on Armenia, and the Armenians, under King Vartan, or Vartan Mamigonian, who's actually a general, I should say, gathered an army and met them in Avarayr, the Battle of Avarayr, a great field. And in that field, the Armenians were outnumbered, by multiples, 5-1, 10-1. The Persians brought cavalry, they brought elephants, they brought great armaments, and on the battlefield, they carried the day. They won the battle. They, in fact, killed Vartan and most of his nobility. Most of the officers, let's say, of the army were slaughtered. It was a terrible military defeat, but the Persians took from the battle that the Armenians are a truly devoted nation. They will not be moved from their Christian faith, and that to convert this people would it would have to be done at the point of a sword and was not worth the effort, or something of that nature. And they said, we will not interfere in your faith. And they made a peace of that sort. There was a guerrilla warfare that lasted for decades, but the bottom line was that the Armenians maintained their faith in that battle of 451. I'll rewind a little bit. There are other steps along the way. A major step took place almost 100 years after Armenians converted to Christianity, and that was the creation of the Armenian alphabet. Prior to that, the Armenians had read in Greek or Assyrian or other languages, and but in early, I think it was 403, Saint Mesro Mashtots, one of our great saints, he had traveled the world, traveled the region, learned about a lot of different languages, came back and established the Armenian alphabet. I think it was first with 36 letters, now with 38, and was able to then translate all the Christian texts into Armenian, and over the time that became less of the elite language and more of the vernacular. But that also helped sort of deepen the connection of Armenians to their Christian faith, the fact that they had their own alphabet. So I would say the conversion in 301, the alphabet in 403, and then the Battle of Avarayr in 451. Those were like sort of the seminal events that differentiated Armenians from their neighbors. And if those things had not taken place, it may be that we would talk about how Armenians is a subset of some other culture, and people would, there wouldn't be a place called Armenia, and there might not be a language called Armenian, and there might not be an Armenian church, for example. And by the way, the Armenian church, just to sort of share this insight, is, among the various worlds, the Christian worlds, you have, of course, the Catholic world, you have the Protestant world, that's very, very diverse, of course, and then the Orthodox world. The Armenians are a member of the Orthodox family. Within the Orthodox family, sort of Eastern Orthodox, Eastern Oriental Orthodox, and we have compatriots. We have co-religionists in Ethiopia and India and elsewhere. So we're part of the Orthodox family, although autocephalous, right, self-governing. So we would have a supreme leader who's based in Armenia, Echmiadzin, and then my church, for example, is part of it, the administration under the Armenian church headquarters in Lebanon, which was formerly in Armenia, but after the genocide, forced to leave and go to Lebanon. So that's the church I pray in, where I was married and I baptized my kids, is part of the Antelias, the city of Antelias in Lebanon, or the great house of Gilia. That's where I fit in.
Thank you for that. I appreciate your account of the sort of the founding myth, or the like we say, the origin story of the Armenian nation. I find it particularly interesting because I think you can glean a lot of information and really discern a nation through their founding myth or their origin story. For example, the nation of Israel, the Jews, they look to their patriarch Abraham and Moses, of course, the Exodus story. And from these stories, I think you can glean such things as faithfulness to God in a history of bondage and oppression, and as you said, resiliency. In the American story, in our founding myth and origin story, we talk about Paul Revere's ride. We talk about the Boston Tea Party, from which we get this idea of independence and Lockean philosophy and the sovereignty of the individual, all very American ideas, but not uniquely American, but certainly American. From the founding myth and the origin story that you just shared, what are some philosophies and characteristics of the Armenian nation that you could extract from that? And, how do you think these could be applicable to other Christian minorities who are suffering throughout the region?
Sure. It's a really good question. And I think it's a good question with no great answer. But I would say that one tension, let's say, or one spectrum upon which you could understand this is to what extent should Christian minorities in this part of the world accommodate and adjust, adapt to existing hierarchies or existing situations, existing structures, and to what extent should they resist, or should they assert themselves in ways? And then if you do assert yourself, how do you assert yourself? If you do accommodate, how do you accommodate? How do you accommodate without losing who you are? and without losing the things that you can't lose? And then how do you assert in ways that don't backfire and that aren't counterproductive? In our myths, right, there's always a heroic myth. And we have David of Sassoon, who's a great myth. And we have all our myths, all our battle myths and warrior myths, and they're very, very important to us. And that spirit sustains us, but it's got to be tempered with, great, I would say, very sober analysis of, where are we? What is the limit of our agency, right? We should not underestimate that which we can control, but we should be very careful not to overestimate that which we can control. And within the realm of that which we can control, how can we seek the most advantage? How can we mitigate the most harm? That's, I think, the very sober, serious political culture that we've earned the hardest of ways. And that's kind of how we have to operate today. And I think that's, it's not always being Braveheart, right? And it's not always being the opposite of Braveheart. It's like being brave and smart. Brave, smart. Maybe that's the answer, right? And so I think that's one of the things that we've emerged from our long history with. Stick together, count on yourselves, but not to the extent where you dismiss the value that can be gained by working with others. So you might enter the political realm saying, we're going to count on ourselves. Then let us go build alliances. Let us go build coalitions, recognizing that these other partners that we're working with, they also have their challenges and their existential threats. And we have to respect that. And the question is, how can we add to their safety in ways that contribute to our safety, but never expecting anyone to do our work for us? The idea that we're going to show up and we're going to raise a flag of moral righteousness, and the world will rally to us and carry us over the finishing line. That is an absolute fiction. And any group that's wants to preserve their place on the planet has got to really dismiss that idea that there's others who are going to save us, and that there's no set of facts, there is no moral argumentation that will bring others to our rescue. Period. End of sentence. That's true. Also, not very appealing. It's not very appealing because, I think I'll give a little philosophy here. Like, for countries that have not governed their own affairs, and the Armenians for 6 centuries didn't govern their own affairs after the fall of our last kingdom in 1375, actually, up until 1918. So there's a long stretch there of non-self-governance. And you develop certain habits when you're not in charge of your own destiny. And one of them is this very strong sense of right and wrong, and that if you're right, that's enough. It's not enough. It's like just the beginning. That's the start of the struggle, not the end of the struggle. So I think within the Armenian culture, political culture that's evolved over the last centuries, does have that accommodating strain, and there's some wisdom in that, but it's not enough. And it also has a very assertive strain. I think the Armenian National Committee certainly, we end up on the more assertive side of the spectrum. But we also understand that the smart move is very often a very carefully calibrated path, between these two different, the accommodationness and assertiveness.
Thanks so much for that.
That's a very interesting concept you raised about the tension between resistance and accommodation. And you briefly touched on how Armenia, throughout much of its history, has been subjugated, and part of different sections of it have been part of different empires. And I was hoping you could take us through how Armenia has dealt with those transitions from being incorporated into the Byzantine Empire and then later to the Ottomans. I was hoping you could touch on how those themes perhaps changed and have shaped Armenian history. Well,
one thing I'll say about the various empires that have governed Armenia, very often those empires were themselves governed by Armenians. So within the Byzantine Empire, there were many, many prominent Armenians at the very heights of Byzantine power. In the Soviet Union, right, the Russian Empire, you might call it, the Russian Empire that preceded it, the Soviet Union that followed, there were a great many Armenians who served in very, very high positions. The same can even be said in the Ottoman Empire, where Armenians were discriminated against. There were still Armenians who were prominent leaders, certainly business leaders and others who were involved in civic life. So one thing I'll say, this is a bit of self-criticism, is that Armenians did serve those other empires well. And we're now in our 30th year, 31st year of independence, reborn independence. And Armenians are relearning the thought of sending your best efforts to govern yourself, not to help others, not to serve other empires, but rather to serve our own destiny. And that's a process. It's a process. Wherever you go in the world, you could parachute an Armenian pretty much anywhere. And within a couple of years, they'll be on their feet and doing very well and able to help others, and their kids will be doing okay. So like we adapt extremely well and serve and contribute to other societies extremely well. Not quite as much back home. So that's I think kind of where we are as a nation is bringing our talents to bear on Armenia's future. If you just like look up famous things invented by Armenians in America, from the MRI machine to the color TV to the ATM, there's like no end of things that Armenians have contributed to this country, just like many immigrant groups. Could we see that same level of economic advancement, development in Armenia? We'd love to see that. That's our destiny. Is to I'll give one poem that I'll just paraphrase a poem that one of our great poets, Sylvia Gabudikian, a really great female poet of the Armenian Soviet era. She described the Armenians as a great tree with long branches that extend far beyond the garden in which it's planted, whose fruit falls and nourishes foreign soil. Right? Our hope would be to see the fruit nourish our soil. That's also nourish our soil, I guess, is the best way to say it.
That's actually a beautiful poem, Aram. Thanks for sharing that. It means a lot, and there are many applications for that. So thank you. And that historical survey and snapshot of Armenian history was actually quite enlightening for even myself, who I've read quite a bit of Armenian history, but a lot of enlightening points there. We'd be remiss, of course, not to focus our discussion to some extent on arguably the darkest and certainly the most consequential episode in Armenian history, and that is the Armenian genocide. Recently, IDC had the pleasure and the honor of working closely with ANCA and other partners to advocate for the recognition of the Armenian genocide in 2019, in October in the House of Representatives, and December of 2019 in the Senate, and then finally recognized by the White House in April, of all days, April 24th of 2021. Aram, we've obviously spoken a lot on the issue of the genocide itself, and I'm sure our listeners are quite familiar with the episode to some extent. How has that shaped the Armenian nation? Now, we talked about how history has shaped the Armenian nation. How has this episode in the 20th century shaped the Armenian nation as we see it today?
I think the legacy of the genocide is that Armenians are acutely aware of the perilous state in which they live, that there are existential dangers to the very existence of Armenians. There are places in the world that face similar threats, but there are many places that don't. If you're born in Brazil or China or France, one of the things you don't have to worry about is your nation being wiped off the map and essentially erased. So that, I think, is very, very central to the legacy of the Armenian genocide. I think also an understanding of other nations that have experienced similar crimes. I think there's a greater awareness of that. There's an understanding that until Turkey and Azerbaijan can move beyond the hatred and intolerance that fueled the genocide, Armenia is going to remain in danger. We have not seen Turkey or Azerbaijan evolve at all beyond what they did in 1915. And that is extremely scary. It would be one thing if they had committed the crime, looked back on it, disowned those who did it. Just the opposite. They've honored those who committed those crimes. They name streets after them. They name schools after them. They honor them in textbooks. And Israel Charney, a great genocide scholar, said, to deny a known case of genocide is to celebrate those deaths and to reserve for yourself the right to continue and repeat those crimes when the opportunity arises. He's exactly right. And the most vivid example of this is every April 24th, we go and protest against Turkey's denial of the Armenian genocide at the Turkish embassy on Massachusetts Avenue here in Washington, D.C. And across the street, with amplifiers plugged into the Turkish embassy's electric system, are people who sing and dance and celebrate and taunt the Armenians. It's not in any way a day of mourning. It's not a day of sadness. It's not even a day where they would say something like, well, they did this to us and we did this to them. It's a day in which they celebrate, not figuratively, literally celebrate the deaths of Armenians. Makes me think they would do it again. I think those very folks, if they're dancing about it today, who knows what they do tomorrow? So I think that understanding of our existential situation, the fate of others who face genocide, and certainly the lack of rehabilitation, the lack of evolution in Turkey itself. I think those are three takeaways. Rich, let me just offer a thanks, though. The 2019 resolutions were a team effort, very, very much a team effort. IDC, from the very start, put its shoulder to the wheel in support of the genocide resolution that ultimately was adopted. It was through our relationship with Indefensive Christians that legislation spoke to not just the Armenians, but the Greeks and the Assyrians and Chaldeans, Syriacs, Arameans, Maronites, and other Christians who were the victims of Ottoman Turkey. And I think that really made the resolution a far better resolution and its adoption even more meaningful. So thank you for putting your shoulder to the wheel, but also in helping us to understand and reflect the true nature of this genocide in the text that was ultimately adopted by both houses of Congress.
And of course, we always are grateful and always indebted to the partnership of ANCA for really being so passionate and energetic around these issues. So what a pleasure it is to partner with you, Aram. You put your finger on something really important there in your conversation and your discussion of the genocide itself. You discussed the current situation and how not much has changed in Turkey or Azerbaijan in the last century plus. So anybody who follows the news in any capacity remembers in the fall of 2020, when the world was in the grips of the COVID pandemic in its darkest days, in its most heady days, I should say. That's when Azerbaijan thought it would be a good time to launch another kinetic attack, yet again on the Armenian nation, claiming hundreds of victims, I should say deaths, many thousands of victims for sure. Aram, could you speak just briefly about that particular episode back in 2020 and then the renewed military aggression that we witnessed this year in 2022, some of the human rights violations, no doubt, that occurred, war crimes that no doubt occurred, and what is the current situation?
Sure. The Azerbaijani attack in 2020 was very much at its heart a Turkish attack and a continuation of the genocide had started in 1915. Nothing, as I mentioned, has really changed. They looked for their opportunity. It took them many, many decades, even 3 decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They saw an opportunity. They took it. If they saw another opportunity tomorrow, they would take it again tomorrow. So the attack took place. Essentially, it was a NATO attack, a Turkey/NATO attack, because that's the level of weaponry that was deployed against the Armenians. So again, just to understand the stakes here, we have something like 85 million Turks living in Turkey, or Turkish citizens anyway, not all Turks. With the 16th largest economy in the world, the second largest economy in largest military in NATO, Azerbaijan to the east, vastly wealthy country due to its oil reserves, fully backed by Turkey and its NATO standard weapons. So that was it. And there's maybe 8-9 million Azeris, 85 or so million people in Turkey, and they're against basically 3 million Armenians who are a genocide survivor state, landlocked, blockaded, partitioned. So the odds are ridiculous. The odds are, 50 to 1, 100 to 1. If you look at the military spending between Turkey and Azerbaijan and Armenia, Armenia would be a tiny, tiny fraction. So this attack took place with the aim of removing Armenians from another part of the indigenous Armenian homeland, which is Artsakh, or which many Americans know as Nagorno-Karabakh. And they succeeded in taking about 3/4 of Artsakh, displacing over 100,000 Armenians from their indigenous homeland. Many have left for good. Others have ended up in Armenia. Some have stayed in Nagorno-Karabakh itself. Very, very brave souls. But that's what took place a little more than 2 years ago. It was followed up just a few months ago with another attack, and there'll be another attack, and there'll be another attack. Azerbaijan has recourse to arms, and they'll use that recourse. They'll use those opportunities at any given moment, and they'll do it unapologetically, openly. One of the great ironies, one of the great sadnesses perhaps, or outrages in our world is that our government, right, my government, our government, the U.S. government, to this day won't point a finger at Azerbaijan for initiating this attack. It plays the game of calling on both sides. So no matter what happens, it's both sides should cut it out. That's the U.S. policy. The Azerbaijani policy is boasting, bragging, full-time, nonstop. We started the war. We won the war. I deserve credit for starting and winning this war. Ilham Aliyev, the president of Azerbaijan, his family's run that country for 50 years, the better part of 50 years. I would say 80% of the last 50 years, one family. And he makes no secret of it. For him, it's like, yeah, we fought this war. We won it. It's a great victory. Our government is still playing the game of, well, we're not really sure. We're not really sure. We have spy satellites. We got human resources. We got SIGINT. We got all these resources, and certainly I'm sure my tax bill, a good chunk of it goes to fund that. All of ours do, and yet we're playing dumb as if we have no idea. We don't even need anything secret. We could just literally listen to the president of Azerbaijan, and he would tell you, "I started this war and fought this war and won this war." In his mind, ethnic cleansing is winning. So that's kind of where we are, and what cascades down from this failure to call out Azerbaijan because of maybe their oil wealth, right? This failure to call out Azerbaijan is that the United States government has turned a blind eye to a great many things. One is the recruitment of mercenaries from Syria, jihadist mercenaries recruited by Turkey, sent to Azerbaijan, deployed to the very front line. They took very high casualties. Apparently, Azerbaijan didn't want its families mourning their own children, right? So they sacrificed other families' children. So there was recruitment of foreign mercenaries, use of prohibited munitions like cluster bombs, the torture and abuse of captives. As recently as 2 months ago, Azerbaijan videotaped and broadcast as if it was like a trophy video, just the machine gunning of captive prisoners. People, handcuffed on the ground, just shot. And when the State Department was asked about this just a week and a half ago, they played dumb, act like, oh yeah, we heard about there were some videos. And then they were asked by the senators, did you look into it? Did you seek to verify? They're like, well, we haven't gotten around to that yet. And so the bottom line is this. Azerbaijan has been the aggressor, the self-described aggressor. Our government is playing the artificial even-handedness, let's say the false parity card of who could possibly know who started this war. And as a result, not holding Azerbaijan to account at all, and frankly, not holding Turkey to account at all. So what message does that send? It sends a message. It's a free pass to, you can kill Armenians, slaughter their children, bomb their houses, desecrate their churches, dig up their cemeteries without cost, without consequence. And that's a very, 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 very unfortunate position. It's not one we're willing to accept, and we battle that fight every single day.
Yeah, completely agree with that assessment and criticism, frankly, of the West, particularly the United States and its policy toward Turkey and Azerbaijan and its prosecution of this war and war crimes, frankly, against the Armenian nation. The question that then naturally follows, at least for me, would be, within the U.S. government, what has been your observation in terms of various parts of government, of course, the executive branch, within which, of course, the State Department falls, as well as Congress? Do you find a glimmer of hope or maybe a difference of opinion that may be favorable in one part of government over the other? And how does that inform and shape ANCA's approach toward advocating?
Sure. So before I talk about the legislative and executive branches, and it's a very significant sort of dynamic there, I'll speak in even broader terms, which is to the extent that issues that we care about are decided out in the light of day, in the sunshine of public scrutiny, the decisions tend to be good decisions, the right decisions. To the extent that they're decided behind closed doors, they tend to be really bad decisions. So if there's an up or down vote of the House, an up or down vote of the U.S. Senate, if there's an open hearing where ideas can be discussed and debated, and in that marketplace of ideas, the good ideas prevail and the weak ideas are set aside, that's very favorable for us. I think that actually in that sense, we're very, 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 we're all pro-democracy, but we're super pro-democracy because democracy and open discourse are our allies. Whereas what gets decided behind closed doors is tough. A friend of mine once, who had lived inside our foreign policy establishment, once shared with me that our problem, our dilemma, is that a great many people that we work with inside the system are auditioning for their next job, right? So in a city like DC, people commit to government service, and some do it for a career. That's very admirable, and others, it's not. They see it as a stepping stone, and professionally, it could be a stepping stone. They certainly need to care for their families, and that's perfectly normal. But some set of those guys, the guys who run our foreign policy establishment, go and then work for vested interests, either domestic or foreign, who pay much, much better. So they now have a vacation home, they have a boat, they got a trust fund for the grandkids, and that often requires, for lack of a better phrase, selling your soul. So a lot of the people who have worked on issues that matter to the Armenian American community have gone on to work for the various petroleum firms that enrich themselves off of Caspian energy, or work for Ilham Aliyev in some capacity, or work for one of his think tanks or one of his universities. And that's just extremely common in DC. So that kind of it cheats Americans of the honest service they are owed by their representatives, elected or otherwise. So we should be able to sit and make our case before government officials with the sense that they're neutral umpires, that they're honest brokers, that we can make our case, others will bring their case. They're charged at any given moment with deciding what serves the U.S. national interest. And that's good. And if they take it seriously, it's good. That doesn't mean that our view has to prevail or that we need to, win every debate and every fight, but it does mean that we get a fair shot, right? But if the person who's serving as that umpire for that year is the next year or in 5 years working for, I don't know, some huge petroleum company. I can name names. I know many of these people who've done extremely well through the revolving door into the Caspian energy world. So if they know that that's where they're going to end up, that's going to inform how they make decisions today. And this happens over and over and over again. And then as a result, you're like, okay, this system is rigged. This system is rigged. The idea that I will bring my best arguments, my best moral case, and sit before people who will be the neutral umpires, it's like that may happen sometimes, but don't bank on it. Don't bank on it at all. So then you figure like, okay, if they're playing that game, I can't play by their rules because I'll just be a sucker for them. I'm not a sucker for them. Our job, my job as a citizen, representing other citizens, is to make sure our voice is heard. And if others are not acting in a moral manner, we have to find moral means, right, to overcome those obstacles. And very often that involves the legislature, right? And I mentioned earlier this idea of sunshine and darkness. The Congress is typically a place where more decisions are made in a more open manner, and that's a good thing. So we worked together last year on blocking or conditioning an F-16 sale to Turkey. If that issue was decided between in some DOD office, right, Deputy Assistant Secretary of something is talking to Minister, Deputy Minister or something in Turkey, right, they'll cut a deal. They'll barter things. They'll sell, frankly, issues that you and I, all of us, care about, right? They'll be tossed around like traded like a pack of cigarettes, and they'll make the deal in private, a deal they would never want public because it would make everyone look bad, maybe except the Turkish counterparts because they would just look clever for carrying the day again. But from a U.S. perspective, they couldn't answer for it in public, and maybe that's exactly why they did it in private. So we try to bring everything out into the open, and the Armenian genocide, the genocide resolution that was stopped in 2019, is a perfect example of that. It was defeated in the 80s and the 90s, again in 2000, again in 2007, again in 2010. We were never in the rooms where the knife was stuck in that resolution, But I know the knife was stuck in that resolution. Don't know exactly whose hand was on it, but we know who was behind the hand. And they got what they wanted, and they did it secretly, and they did it without fingerprints. And that's, in my view, it's morally wrong, but also undemocratic. So we would like to see our issues brought into the open. I think, generally speaking, if the issue of what is the fate, how can America protect Christians in the Middle East, right? A very fair question, right? If that were set upon the table and debated in an open manner, I think we would have far better outcomes than the dirty deals that are struck with all the various dictators who are so viciously persecuting Christians in the Middle East, right? Behind closed doors, it's going to be a disaster. Out in the open, we have hope.
You raise the troubling relationship between the U.S. officials and the U.S. publicly with Turkey and Azerbaijan, and you've also alluded to some of the reasons why that may be. But I was hoping you could speak to why Armenia is really a more viable partner for the United States. You've touched on these already, but if you could expand on that in detail.
Sure. I think the geopolitics are complicated. Armenia finds itself under existential threat from Turkey and Azerbaijan, and has a security relationship with Russia as a result. There are cultural and religious connections with Russia. But I think the most immediate, the most pressing, the biggest driver of that relationship is existential fear of total destruction by Turkey and Azerbaijan. So that geopolitics makes things complicated. The fact that Armenia has a closed border, Turkey blockades Armenia, Azerbaijan blockades Armenia. The fact that Armenia can only look north and south for any trade, any energy, any access to markets or resources, also complicates things. Where Armenia has natural advantages is on the cultural plane or the civilizational plane. Armenia is I would say, a European country outside of Europe. Its values are very democratic, I would say, deeply anchored in the West, not divorced from the East in any sense, but deeply anchored in the West with a global diaspora that connects it to literally every part of the globe. So I think the fact that we share a faith with most Americans also, so there's the religious connection, the democratic connection, the bridge between East and West, the fact that Armenians have a global diaspora. These are all like major assets and drivers, I would think, of stronger U.S.-Armenia relations that are not derivative of U.S. policy on Russia or Iran or NATO or Caspian energy, but that they deserve to be, there needs to be a U.S.-Armenia relationship on its own merits. And unfortunately, again, this goes back how the State Department, Defense Departments work. The path very often to advancement is not an appointment or a tenure in Armenia, but it might be in Ankara, right? It might be in Baku. So the way the bureaus are very often organized, certain countries will get on a fast track to advancement, and others are a little bit more dead end. So I think hopefully we'll see some change in that score.
Thanks a lot for that, Aram. Looking ahead into 2023 and beyond, we're curious to hear what some of the priorities that ANCA is setting for itself.
Sure. We have three key priorities. First is to stop U.S. military aid to Azerbaijan. There's a law in place that does stop U.S. military aid to Azerbaijan. It's called Section 907. The president, President Bush, President Obama, President Trump, and now President Biden, they've all waived that law or suspended that law. President Biden did so even after Azerbaijan attacked in 2020, which was very disappointing, all the more so because he had promised during his campaign, he had actually pushed President Trump to cut the military aid to Azerbaijan. Of course, when he got sworn in, he continued that military aid. We're very upset about that. So we need to stop that. If the president won't stop it of his own accord, we're working through Congress to try to enforce that restriction, to statutorily cut the military aid to Azerbaijan. They're an oil-rich country. They don't deserve American military assistance, but they still get it, and it gives them a green light to keep doing what they're doing. If the United States was upset, if we were outraged, if we were troubled at all by Azerbaijan's aggression, surely we would have cut the military aid to them, but we haven't, and that sends all the wrong signals. That's number one. Number two is delivering U.S. humanitarian aid to Nagorno-Karabakh, to Artsakh. And the head of USAID is someone who knows Armenian history extremely well. Her most famous book, A Problem from Hell, its first chapter started with a history of the Armenian genocide. And Samantha Power is in charge of the USAID, but under her leadership, under the leadership at the State Department of Secretary Anthony Blinken, we have not seen any meaningful U.S. humanitarian assistance to Artsakh. We interpret that as Azerbaijan getting a veto over, food and water for families in Artsakh, and that's really disgraceful. We should not let any country hold our aid packages hostage. That's the second. The third is holding Azerbaijan accountable for war crimes, for the mercenaries, for the prohibited munitions, for the abuse of Armenian prisoners of war, and also the discovery of U.S. parts in the Turkish drones that Azerbaijan used to kill so many Armenians. Some of them were shot down. They discovered as many as 10 U.S. parts, U.S. components, said right on them, made in the USA. And there have been many inquiries from Congress asking the administration to look into that as a potential violation of arms export laws, but we've not seen any action. Again, this goes back to the fact that Azerbaijan, I think by virtue of its oil wealth, is getting a free pass.
Thanks for that, Aram. And of course, looking into 2023 and beyond, you can always count on In Defense of Christians to stand arm in arm with you on all these initiatives, because what affects Armenia also affects Christians of the Middle East and the Caucasus and Northern Africa. There's a strong connective tissue between all these issues, namely dismissing bad behavior and not holding bad actors accountable. So we thank you for joining us today, Aram, and we wish you a great day.
Thank you so much, Rich. This has been a great experience. Thank you so much.